Good morning, Australia from the Philippines. Today, I am fortunate to have a conversation with Dr. Thayer, Professor Emeritus of the University of New South Wales, as we discuss Vietnam's proactive measures against COVID-19 and defense posture in South China Sea. Good morning, Professor Thayer.
Good morning. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll go direct to the point here. Vietnam has been underrated in its response to the coronavirus pandemic. It took a while before the international community noticed proactive measures in flattening its medical curve from the bottom-up approach. In fact, Vietnam can be hailed as the most successful Southeast Asian nation in containing the disease. What did Vietnam have to do to gain that respect, and what should the world learn from this communist state?
Well, let me start by stating the obvious that when the word of the COVID-19 began to leak out of China, the world's attention turned not only to China, but to China's neighbors, South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And as the virus began to spread to Iran and Europe, there was an intensity of interest in how those countries were coping, and Vietnam in particular, because it was one of the first off the mark to react. And I've got a series of points to make. We now have a doctor from Oxford at a clinical unit in Ho Chi Minh who's been there for a while, who's observed this firsthand, who gave an interview with Rappler, with Emeritus Wutig. And he and I are in agreement, as political scientist versus a doctor. Vietnam success and could serve as a model after the fact, though. It acted quickly and decisively. It identified the threat and acted. And what did it do? It happened to have 16 workers from a Japanese firm that were sent to Wuhan for a conference. Right. So they came back and brought the virus with them. So Vietnam isolated them and then had to isolate the entire commune of 10,000 people. So they isolated and then began the treatment, testing of them. But then they began to identify and contract trace. And what the Dr. Thwaites from Oxford has pointed out is that Vietnam is unique in that it did F2 and F3, second and third hand tracing as the virus spread in the country. So it isolated, quarantined, treated, and then did extensive contract tracing. Vietnam very quickly put restrictions on air travel to and from China, despite pressure, border controls with China, and of course, Laos and Vietnam. Key, Dr. Thwaites and I stressed different things, but was the information and communication system. And he stresses the public health aspect through a National Center for Disease Control that used SMS texting. And then I would use all the apparatus of a communist propaganda system of loudspeakers on every block in every village, controlled press, video. But we all know that one of these videos of people dancing and washing their hands and hygiene went viral. So Vietnam is very effective at posters. Next, it introduced the domestic measures. We're all familiar, the face mask, social distancing, self-isolation, and then finally, the piece of the cake, a lockdown nationally to control local hotspots. It mobilized retired nurses, public health officials, and doctors, called them back into service, and then had the military prepare barracks and other places in case the thing got very worse. And now that it seems to have peaked in Vietnam, the military did all this, in a sense, somewhat like the Javits Center in New York that never got used, but nonetheless, they had made these preparations. And then Vietnam, additionally to all at domestic, it's also ASEAN chair. So in February, it held the first teleconference with the health ministers from the ASEAN +3, China, Japan, South Korea ministers. And it also then held a special summit. The normal summit was postponed to June and then recalled back into May as a special summit on the COVID-19 disease, as they called it, rather than pandemic. So all those
not the Chinese virus.
Yeah, right. Not the Chinese virus. So the lessons that others could learn, and this is I'm influenced by Professor Dr. Thwaites, good epidemiology. He said medicine that deals with diseases, and he said it was done the old-fashioned way, the tracing, not this police apparatus and mobile phone surveillance and everything, but just index card and going out and tracing. But because second, the communications that I mentioned already, but he thought through the SMS, because virtually every Vietnamese is born with a mobile phone in their hands.
Right,
It's
right.
high penetration. And finally, he pointed out a whole series, the legacy of previous epidemics in Vietnam, from SARS to foot and mouth and other epidemics versus pandemics that have affected the country, where a national center has trained a cadre of public health workers to a very high standard, and had two major, in the north and the south, specialist hospitals to handle COVID cases. So that, my answer to your question is all the items above, plus an excellent public health system, highly professional. And this professor doctor that I'm relying on is embedded in the hospital in Ho Chi Minh that treated the worst cases there, and is in daily contact with the national hospital in the north. So when he was talking and giving this interview with Rappler, he was able, can you believe Vietnam's no death? Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Very authoritatively.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful, given the comprehensive interventions done by the Vietnamese government. But, China and Vietnam are almost in the same boat under the totalitarian regime. But observers would dispute that Vietnam's openness to social media help authorities rely on information to formulate strategies in combating the unseen enemy. Do you think China's lack of transparency and cover-up of disease statistics led to the escalation of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's two parts to your question. The authorities in Vietnam did not rely on Facebook. They relied on their expert knowledge. I think that comes clear from the Oxford doctors thing, from the CDC network in Vietnam. In Vietnam, really where it was tough, banned fake news and fined several hundred people for passing on rumors and other things on the internet. So they monitored that quite carefully. But Vietnamese academics who have written said they generally, the authorities allowed a free flow of discussion about COVID and how to mitigate it and the appropriateness of social distancing and other face masks, etc., on the internet. And this was supportive of the government and so constructively critical, where people looked at ideas. So that allowed expression. And then the use of the social media, there's no private ownership of newspapers, television, radios in Vietnam. It's all state-run, and the same message was consistently given. Vietnam held daily press conferences. Vice Minister with Health would give figures. The Public Health Ministry was the only official source of information. They set up a national steering committee, of course, but in other words, they controlled the information. They were transparent, and that's where they get high marks for this. And they use the patriotism, and we've seen it in Britain and the US. This is the enemy facing Vietnam, and they use everybody must unite to meet the common enemy. So, and but Vietnamese are used to that mobilization tactic. So now, one about China, of course, China bears a huge responsibility.
Definitely.
When the virus broke out and they learned it could be transmitted human to human, we have a lot of circumstantial evidence that it tried to hide, suppress, and even mistreat some of the early whistleblowers that got that on the books. And this is not a Wuhan, even though it originated there, like the Spanish flu, we called it that. But in other words, it's a flu that's going to affect the entire world. So that as a result of the Spanish flu, forgetting the name games, the blame games, this is new, it's more deadly than we've experienced. And then China should have contacted and been more upright with the World Health Organization that could have alerted and could have really, quietly, doesn't have to make a big public deal, start letting the ambassadors of countries concerned know that this is occurring and the steps that China taking. And this is where we should have had the seeds planted of international cooperation rather than name pointing.
Right. Taking off from that word cooperation, in one of your interviews, you said that Vietnam has to cooperate with China, not only to contain the spread of the virus, but to protect its economy as chair of the ASEAN. Is this a sound policy that other Southeast Asian countries may adopt?
Well, unfortunately, when we look at the special summit,
Right.
and we find a list of what they're doing, a lot of it is aspirational. But the only concrete thing was to set up a common fund to which everybody could contribute. But the rest, and I'm putting words in the communique's mouth, I don't have it in front of me, but we should do this, we would like to do that, this is recommended, ASEAN is like if you watch the reporting on the EU, a 10-member country, had 10 different responses. Every country, what the Philippines did about Manila, etc., didn't mirror anything else. Cambodia was livid at the border with Vietnam, was closed when Vietnam closed it because they didn't treat, ASEAN is supposed to be a community of caring nations. What happens to workers from the Philippines who are in another country? They were left out of anybody's plans. What about Vietnamese workers? So that sort of thing. And then what happened about tourists or officials or students? ASEAN didn't think through that. In other words, you're Filipino, you might be studying in Vietnam, a Vietnamese studying in Thailand, and all of a sudden the host country does it only for its own people, and you're left out. And Singapore, I think, found its migrant barracks accommodation for its visiting labor force, then later turned out to bite Singapore because it was a scene of the coronavirus.
Okay, now we discuss about the issues in the South China Sea. The People's Liberation Army Navy continuously patrols maritime domain, and even the PLA Air Force is protecting China's airspace in the contested South China Sea as part of its standard operating procedure, as you said in one of your interviews. And China does not take advantage of the world's partial lockdown. Do you think it is unethical for China to flex its military muscles while the world is facing a health crisis?
Well, I prefer to put it this way. The COVID-19 pandemic has had no observable impact on China's business as usual approach in the South China Sea. And part of that business approach, among assertions of sovereignty, is Chinese reactiveness to any activity like oil exploration by foreign vessels, where it stamps down quite hard. And of course, the US Navy freedom of navigation and presence patrol. For a long time now, well over a decade, the People's Liberation Army Navy has conducted what they call sovereignty rights protection. The waters of China, they're only protecting Chinese interests because Filipinos and Vietnamese are stealing Chinese fish. They're trying to give contracts to foreign oil companies to take away China's oil. China has then used lawfare in all of this, passing unilateral fishing bans, more recently renaming districts. In part, that's to force aircraft and ships to use the Chinese names. Right. Then the Chinese Coast Guard has replaced the Navy as the pointy end. The Navy is always there over the horizon, so to speak, able to answer a call. But the Chinese Coast Guard and 5,000-ton and larger ships are out there. That's the sharp end. China's honed the maritime militia and so-called fishermen, and in particularly satellite operations over the Philippine areas, Pagasa, show that the fishermen are not fishing. They're there to monitor. They're being paid to sit on their boats every day just to prevent Filipino fishermen. Then all this at sea, you have the continuing consolidation and militarization of the artificial islands. Probably the high tide of militarization has already been reached because of all the missiles and other systems, but now we're getting so-called scientific research stations that are there looking at the resources in the area. And finally, I alluded to it earlier about Malaysia. There's a tailored response to foreign oil exploration. Last year, it was the Rosneft Russian firm hiring a Japanese drill ship that was harassed. This year, it's Malaysia hiring a Panama flag exploration ship in Malaysian waters that's being harassed. So is it unethical for China to flex its muscles? It's certainly not helpful. It's just showing that China, as I say, conducts business as usual because it's China first, to borrow an expression, and not the countries it's working, supposedly cooperating with in the region.
Okay. It seems the world sees a leadership vacuum in global security and health crisis. China has been advocating for multipolarity as an expression of China's displeasure of the American-centric world order. How do you see the post-COVID world order? Is it going to be a bipolar world system or a shift to a concert of great powers?
Right. Well, what I'm going to say, we have to, in the future, overlook the Trump and Duterte administrations
Right.
to get our time frame. First, as a preface, clear the UN and its subsidiary, the World Health Organization, are not showing leadership. And China is opportunistically taking advantage of the Trump administration's largely go it alone. When you get press releases from State Department about American financial contributions, they go back a decade to give you a big lump sum rather than what I'd say the paltry millions that have been given over. Even places like the EU is having difficulty uniting itself. And I mentioned before ASEANs Response, which gets me up. I'm a fan of Amitav Acharya, a colleague that I've known for a long time. And I think bipolar and multipolar are terms that no longer have usefulness because of the integrated, globalized nature of the world. He uses the term multiplex. And without getting too much in the weeds and defining it, it just means that there are various kinds of coalitions of states and non-state actors and between states. So multipolarity doesn't quite capture the Philippines being a putative ally of the US, but close to China and a member of ASEAN. In other words, they're cross-cutting, and from time to time, one theme is played up or down against the other. So a multiplex world is that the most the major powers could try to do is have a power of veto, but they don't have, it's a negative power, they don't have the power of forcing the world to follow what they want. Countries can resist, shirk, form other alliances, or ignore it. And forcing small countries to obey big countries, there are ways of evading it. So the post-COVID order, I think, depends how long it's going to last. And some are saying it's like herpes or HIV/AIDS. These are diseases for which there will be no vaccines, and therefore it will be with us. And the new normal of daily life is quite separate from your question. It's how it's going to act internationally. And with the bad blood between the US and China, one can't see a concert of nations, a G2 that countries were promoting or fearing in the early part of the Trump administration. Nor can we see a bilateral world because Europe is untethered really from the US these days. So but it's not multipolar. Because you have Russian oil going to Europe, when the US wants to have them dependent on the US. So that's the multiplex world. And then I'm stressing the states, but they're coalitions of non-state actors, of groups and movements across the world that also play a heavy role at particular times. One might see the copying of demonstrations around the world to end restrictions on COVID as an example of breaking down centralized state power, where the CDC in the United States, which is the authority, doesn't have it because citizens in various states in America can demonstrate with weapons and close down their local authority.
And now for my last question, perhaps the Philippines is sandwiched by two competing great powers in South China Sea. You know that, between the US and China. And in the middle of pandemic, Vietnam remains as the last man standing in fighting sovereignty rights and maritime entitlements, as you said, in the region. From the lens of your expertise, what advice can you give to Filipino leaders and policymakers?
Well, I do that with some sense of apprehension, telling a Filipino country and offering advice. But I do say I first visited the Philippines in late '59 and have been back many times earlier. First, I say is remember your own revolution. Remember, you fought for your independence and you fought for sovereignty against Spain and then almost simultaneously the US. And that's a continuing theme that runs through, but too much reliance on an external power, you lose your sovereignty or it's degraded. But to remember and be proud of being a Filipino, a movement that unified the island archipelago, and that's important. But also don't be too quick, I would say, to end the alliance with the United States. I think a more thorough review and public discussion is necessary than just the president's proclivities is necessary to weigh the pros and cons and what that would mean. To me, as an American and an Australian, in the Aquino administration, I went and gave a paper. And I told the Filipinos, because back then you were navel gazing, I mean, looking at your navel, and the Americans aren't going to come to our assistance. The alliance is useless. And I made the point that your mutual defense treaty is exactly the same word for word as the one with Australia. And so my point about alliances they are what you make them, and it's a two-way street. And for a long time, prior to Aquino, Congress hasn't funded a Filipino military force modernization program. And if you look at Vietnam, it has. It's spending 2.5% of GDP over the last decade to build up self-help defense force. The Philippines claim, you can't fight. It's not a question of fighting a war with China. That's not it. It's even having the minimal capability to know what's going on and to enforce it. And that's where an alliance comes in, where the United States, at least under Trump, has gone where no previous American administration has, and clarify that the West Philippine Sea is part of the West Pacific. The South China Sea is part of it. Whereas before the U.S. said, no, mutual defense treaty preceded the Philippines' claim to Kalayaan. And therefore, we're not bound to protect those particular features. But an attack on the metropolitan area armed forces of the Philippines in the West Pacific would trigger, the same as in Australia, consultations. It's not an automatic NATO all-in. So the Philippines has to bear that in mind. And when I look at Vietnam, I say to the Philippines, who are your friends? Vietnam has twice been the unanimous choice of the Asia bloc for nomination to the UN Security Council, and it has twice won it in the last decade. Now, how many, Australia can't even get into the Security Council. It's blocked, it belongs to the WEGOG group. It's called Western Europe and Others group rather than Asia. But Vietnam has made friends all over the world. And maybe the Philippines should look at its legacy of too many years in Hollywood and get out and make more friends around the world and in the region to have that respect that Vietnam has. And I said, besides the defense self-help, in other words, why be isolated and look only to China because it can give you large amount? Vietnam goes out of its way to be friends with countries in every continent. So when the UN General Assembly votes on its nomination, it is overwhelmingly accepted. And why? Because countries trust Vietnam, which is not an American ally, to act independently and look after itself and not join one against the other. So if the Philippines does leave the American alliance, not aligning with Vietnam, that's not my answer, but its model of building up the Philippines' respect for itself, building up a minimal self-help force, and then through peacekeeping and other activities, Filipino workers abroad, which are already there, engage in public diplomacy to make the Philippines a positive brand name, where then China and other countries have to worry, as they have to about Vietnam. You push the Philippines too far, you're going to get its friends to react. We're not talking about all the way down to armed conflict, but we're talking about political influence. And at the moment, I have to say, who are the Philippine friends? And can you have more? And Vietnam had a slogan, be a reliable friend and partner to all. More friends, less enemies were Vietnam's, and they achieved it.
Okay, without much ado, thank you very much, Dr. Thayer, for your expertise and wisdom in this academic conversation. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Chester,